Welcome, everyone, to Crime Scenes and Cultures, where we demystify the mysterious. We invite you to sit back and relax as we talk about when the secular meets the sacred. We're looking at cases and incidents through the years when crime scene professionals, forensic professionals, and public safety agencies have encountered religious cultures and ceremonies that sometimes are unfamiliar to responders. We have a great show for you today as we look into the world of Norse paganism and the reality of this sacred tradition. This week, we're joined by special guest host Steven Katz. Steven is a forensic archaeologist based out of Chicago who has been practicing for over 25 years. He's worked in all 50 states and 7 different countries. His specialties include human skeletal analysis, burial excavation, and recovery of human remains. Let's give a big warm welcome to Steven. Steven, welcome to the show.
Okay, Tony, thank you for the wonderful introduction. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to be on a show, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of my experiences and insights with everyone.
Wonderful, and we are glad to have you here. This week, we want to share about a culture that is frequently mentioned among, of all things, stories of hate groups and white supremacists. But actually, this culture has an origin and a life outside of this appropriation. Now, I'll tell you, back in the late 1980s, I would frequently hear stories about hate groups embracing what some were calling, quote, Viking religion. Praxis would be described as with names like Odinism, heathenism, and Asatru. And we'd see incidents involving individuals with tattoos of Nordic gods and runic alphabets. But to those familiar with traditional neo paganism, we were familiar that they're with the magical religious practices of communities that embraced Norse paganism that were far from being hate groups. In fact, several religious communities came together and formed campaigns against these hate movements and sought to educate the general public about the old ways of this religion. So, what does this religion look like? And what would a scene involving a victim that honored these spiritual traditions look like? How would forensic professionals interact with sacred spaces, those artifacts, and even members of these traditions? This week, we are pleased to introduce a friend of the show, a practitioner, and a cultural consultant, DJ Schilling. DJ has worked in the criminal justice field since 2006 as a correctional officer, security threat group specialist, and gang instructor. His specialties are the use of the runes and Norse pagan symbology that are used by white supremacist groups, criminal and intelligence processes, and alternative religions and beliefs such as radicalized Asatru and Odinism, Christian identity, and various occult topics. In 2020, DJ authored the book Norse and Germanic Runes and Symbols, a field reference guide for law enforcement and corrections. Since that time, he has shared information about the runes and white supremacist symbology with many U.S. based law enforcement gang investigator associations and various local, state, and federal agencies, prosecutors, and police in the United Kingdom. DJ, welcome to Crime Scenes and Cultures.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
DJ, I've wanted to have you on for a while now, and I'm so glad we finally have you here. So, when we hear about these traditions, we often hear multiple terms used like Asatru, Odinism, heathenism. What exactly do these words mean, and is there a difference in these traditions?
The term Asatru, as it sits today, comes really from the early 70s from over in Iceland, when you were looking at the very formative days of, I suppose, what we would call conventional Asatru. Was a farmer over there, Sveinbjorn Beintinsen, who decided to resurrect the worship veneration of the old gods and goddesses. Asatru simply means faith to the Asir in Old Norse. Odinism is going to be very, very similar to Asatru. Asatru being pantheistic, where they recognize a number of gods, Odinism does as well, but they tend to be what we would call, I suppose, henotheistic,
Mm.
where they know all the gods are there and they acknowledge that, but they really focus on Odin in particular. Heathenism, that's more of an older term referring to people of the heath. Originally, I believe it came from Christians hundreds of years ago when they would refer to people out in the countryside who still clung to some of the old practices. It was a little bit more of a derogatory term.
It sounds very similar to the early use of the term pagan.
Yes. Yeah, pagan, paganus, people of the earth, I believe, something like that.
When we talk about true to the Aesir are those deities?
Yes, you're looking at I prefer to call it the Germanic pantheon. Most people would know it more as the Norse gods. You're thinking of gods like Odin and Thor and Heimdall, Freya, Frey, Freyr, 12 different main gods altogether. And there are other gods and goddesses as well from different areas, but that tends to be the primary focus of Asatru, those gods who would reside in Asgard, like Odin and Thor.
So when we talk about these different spiritual traditions, what does that look like in a practitioner's life? What does the spirituality, what does magic and spiritual encounters, what does that look like in the life of a practitioner?
That's a really good question because really depends on the practitioner. Some people pay lip service to it. Some people will do maybe a short ritual upon waking up when they first put their Thor's hammer on for the day, which is a common symbol between both Asatru and Odinism alike. They might do a ritual to hail the rising of the sun, that type of thing. There's been various short rituals written for people that want to do things like that. Other people prefer to not be quite as spiritual about it, but instead show how they believe through how they conduct themselves, ideally with honor, not being afraid to go into battle, so to speak, I guess you might say. But in how they conduct themselves with honesty and ideally trying to be the best person that they can.
This is very much a far cry from the philosophy of a lot of the hate groups. Contrast when you're trying to work toward the betterment as opposed to some of the hate groups there and their philosophies.
Oh, very much so. They'll still list a lot of the same things that the other groups do. When you would talk about the 9 noble virtues, truth, honesty, so on and so forth. And that's one thing to list them, but to actually practice them is a different story. It's kind of like people that work with gangs, they'll find these manifestos that say, once you're a member of the gangster disciples, let's say, if you go to prison, you're not allowed to deal drugs, you're not allowed to engage in sex, so on and so forth. But those things get violated all the time. And a lot of the white supremacists don't conduct themselves very honorably. A lot of it's a weird mixture of Marvel comics and a few other things. It can be a little bit out there. For a lot of them, the first exposure they really get to reading literature on it is when they're first incarcerated, it seems.
Wow. So the literature that you see, like in corrections, is this propaganda from hate groups or?
A lot of that we try to weed out. At the jail I work in, at least we do. Some of the prison systems have a hard time with this due to law that was passed called our LUPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000, which basically says that if somebody believes a certain way, that it is the facility's duty to do their best to facilitate that within reasonable means. And as a result, you get literature sometimes coming in that might be from organizations that were out there like Wotan's Volk, which was run by David Lane, who originally a member of the Silent Brotherhood. Very racist version of Odinism is what you'd be looking at that point. I'm really big on keeping an eye on what people read because usually by just looking at a person's bookshelf, you can get a pretty good idea of what that person is like. And if they have a book like March of the Titans by Arthur Kemp, A History of the White Race. In my mind, that has very little to do with Asatru and Germanic religion, Germanic faith. Because now we're just looking at full-blown racial theory straight out of World War II, essentially.
So the practitioners who are not part of this appropriating of these traditions that are that make up the majority of
Hmm.
normative practitioners. Are these communities, are Norse pagan communities, organized? Is there a social structure?
Somewhat. For instance, in some of the larger prison systems, once a person is accepted into what they would call the kindred,
Mm-hmm.
which is a group of also true practitioners who would gather together for ritual purposes. They might take turns at whoever is the goatee for the day, the goatee being the priest. You do have a male and female presence with the priesthood there, the goatee and the githya. Either they both carry equal amounts of power as far as that goes. And that's what you'll see on the outside. On the outside, it's a little bit different. You have groups like Troth, who, if anybody is looking for literature for a correctional facility, they come highly recommended from me. Their literature is vetted very closely for ensuring that it doesn't have racial elements in it or elements that promote any type of white supremacist beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
But those kindreds and that organization has a program that people can run through in order to become ordained,
Mm.
which is something you don't normally see. If you're an independent practitioner, kind of a lone wolf, so to speak, you're, of course, free to act as the priest yourself, do your own rituals as well. There's a lot of freedom as far as that type of thing goes.
Several years ago, I attended a pagan festival, and there was actually a public ritual being done by members of an Asatru community. But
Okay.
traditionally, are ceremonies private or public? Or does that just depend on the community?
It really depends on the community. Some communities are right out there and they'll say, hey, if you want to come as a guest, you're more than welcome. Probably ask that you don't participate if you don't understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But some kindreds are a bit more closed about that. It just depends. It's personal preference quite a bit.
So, our focus here looks at public safety encounters
Hmm.
that typically occur in a residence or a scene of a specific incident. Forensic professionals encountering a sacred space dedicated to the gods. What might this look like? What kind of artifacts might they encounter?
There's a number of different things. There might be a shrine or an altar erected dedicated to a god or the gods overall. On those shrines, you're usually going to find statuettes, figurines of the gods themselves. You might find a wooden bowl it might have runes inscribed on it. It really just depends. That would be called a bowly or the offering bowl.
Mm-hmm.
You might find a drinking horn or a cup with a liquid in it, maybe a bottle of mead. Really depends as far as what type of beverage that they drink. There are some people who choose not to.
Mm-hmm.
But I think here you're going to definitely find probably a set of the runes. Traditionally, they would be carved in wood, and those runes, if the person took care to follow the older practices faithfully, those runes would probably be inscribed on the wooden rune blanks,
Mm-hmm.
the discs, I guess you would call them. And they're going to be red in color, and they might appear to be a little bit off red, maybe a little bit brownish.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because some people use their own blood in order to personalize that rune set to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's the old theory where blood gives life, that type of thing, ties
Mm-hmm.
an object to a person magically.
So, in that instance, there may be the discovery of blood on a rune, but that is not to be immediately, taken as some sort of violence has occurred.
No,
That's
no, not at all.
that's
Um,
I know, when we see blood, our first impulse many times, particularly if you're working a scene,
mhm,
is you want to know where it came from, who it belonged to and how did it get there.
exactly. Yeah, the thing with blood, the other thing to keep in mind is you might find the person is doing some sort of a runic spell working. If that's what they're doing and they're writing something out on paper, that could be written out in the person's blood as well. For instance, what they would call a bind rune. which is a number of runes that might be stacked up one on top of the other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still recognizable as being a runic symbol.
Mm-hmm.
It's just they're hard to decipher because which letter do you start with?
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes in the formation of those, you end up getting other runes that pop out of it
Mm-hmm.
inadvertently because those figures are formed.
Mm-hmm.
So if a person is doing a particular magical working, they might put together like the Thurisaz rune and maybe the Isa rune together. And those two runes in conjunction with each other, if they were written over the top of a person's name in blood, would tell me that they're trying to curse that person to great pain and harm and stillness in their life to where they can't progress, as an example.
You know, when we mention runes, I remember several years ago receiving a letter from a correctional facility, and the officers at that facility had found where there were people in the facility that were using forms of a runic alphabet to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout the years, we would see runes found in tattoos and used as various forms of divination. Stephen, I know there are even archaeological discoveries here in the U.S. that have found forms of the runic alphabet. Can you speak to this?
Yes, there have been several archaeological discoveries here in the United States with features that contain inscriptions that resemble the runic alphabet. Most of them have turned out to be false, however, but there's one site that I really can think about it's past public scrutiny and it's more legitimate, I
Mm-hmm.
guess. The site's the Hebner Runestone Park in southeastern Oklahoma.
Yes.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the origins of the discovery of the feature containing the runic alphabet date to the early 20th century when a young girl named Gloria Farley was introduced to the feature as a child. And just for clarity, archaeologists, we typically define features contextually as representing human non portable activity. So that's
Mm.
when I mentioned feature, that's what I'm talking about. At Hebner Runestone Park, they've heard a whole bunch of theories regarding the origin of the ruined stone, including the Irish, the French, the Egyptians, and my favorite, extraterrestrials.
It's always the aliens.
Yeah,
It's always the aliens.
yeah. So I guess the general conclusion, though, by most people and especially the locals around the park, is that the markings were made between 600 and 800 AD by Vikings or Scandinavians, and it more or less signifies a boundary marker or a land claim of sorts.
Fascinating.
But that's a little bit, uh, that's still a lot of speculation, and that assertion about it being a boundary marker land claim has been especially contested recently by Swedish expert Heinrich Williams, who says it's impossible to know the age of ruined stone. So he kind of throws that out.
Wasn't it carved into sandstone as well?
Yeah,
So that would even be harder to age forensically.
yeah, exactly. And you never know how those came about because I can remember being in high school. Some of my friends, had a little bit too much to drink or whatever, and they started carving into basalt and sandstone in Phoenix and doing more or less the same thing. So,
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, thank you so much. DJ, I was wondering, historically, where we see hate groups coming in and embracing elements of Norse paganism. Tell us about how these two worlds collide.
It kind of goes back to once again the early 70s. You had Sveinbjorn Beintinson over in Iceland starting up also true. But then at the same time in the United States, you also had Stephen McNallen, who's now with the Also True Folk Assembly, starting up his newsletters like the Runestone, and he started up an organization, I believe, called the Viking Brotherhood.
Mm.
And it started to become popular among white inmates as a religion that they could embrace for themselves without having to share with anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So they've always kind of had what they call a folkish point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Within Also True, you have different mindsets, I guess you might say. There's the folkish mindset that believes that you can only practice this faith if you have the bloodline to practice it with.
Mm.
Then there's the universalists, like the Troth, who say anybody and everybody is welcome. If you feel a call to it, join in. And then you have a group called the Tribalists that are a little bit of a mix between the two, where you basically have to go there and be initiated in, so to speak, where you join the tribe.
Mm-hmm.
So they have their gatekeepers a little bit. Folkish side of things, we actually have a church here in Minnesota, up in Murdoch, Minnesota, Baldershoff. That's part of the Also True Folk Assembly. That was a fairly big controversy a while back, because that's exactly how they believe, is the folkish beliefs, where only white people are really truly welcome. So we go on through the 70s, 80s, all that, and we come up to the modern day, and it's almost synonymous now in the prison system. If you say neo-Nazi, the person 9 times out of 10 practices Norse paganism of some sort, or at least he claims he does.
Mm-hmm.
Within the prison system, it's, of course, a lot more structured. Prisons here in Minnesota, they have an outdoor rock ring with a fire pit in there. I believe they share that space with the Native Americans, and they'll do outdoor rituals there with fire pit. One of the items I didn't mention that you might find in an Also True altar is also a drinking horn, a large cattle horn that's been cleaned out, washed out, and people drink out of it as part of the ritual. And the prisons accommodate all that for the sake of our lupas, so they don't violate federal law.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, it's kind of a totality of circumstances thing, trying to determine that, though, whether it's racist or not. And that's where I say, if a person is able to, if you're a prison programmer who's in charge of the library, know what religious books you have in there, and consult an organization maybe like the Troth, or heck, email me at the end of all this, and I'd be more than happy to help somebody with that as well. What it boils down to is there should be no big thing concerning the Nazis in there. It should just be strictly, these are the gods. What are the rituals that we use to worship these gods? Are there references to white race? To go back in time just a little bit from the 70s, a lot of this does stem from pre-World War II Germany, when the Weimar Republic was still in place. Right in the big boom of spiritualism and everything else, you had groups forming over in Germany like the Thule Society. A number of high-ranking Nazis ended up being members of that. You had runologists like Guido von List, who claimed that Odin came to him after he had eye surgery and went blind and gave him a new set of runes, which incidentally is the first set of runes I've ever heard of that haven't been used strictly as an alphabet at some point. They were just created out of thin air for mystical purposes. I shouldn't say thin air. They did have influences from the other ones, but then the Nazis came in and ascribed their meaning over the top of everything. One little known fact about Nazi Germany is they didn't like if there were other people practicing runology. And some of those guys ended up getting put in concentration camps because their version of how they believed didn't line up with the National Socialists. So,
interesting.
To say people that practice any form of Norse paganism or work with the runes are all Nazis would be, that's a gross overstep, I'd say.
Absolutely. Bringing this back to traditional communities, what advice would you give to public safety agencies that encounter practitioners at scenes? What transcultural advice could you give us? Let's say someone's working a crime scene, there are individuals at the scene that are practitioners, or you're interviewing someone that's a practitioner, or a public safety agency comes upon a scene while a ceremony is going on.
Oh, that one could be a little bit touchy. I think the first thing would be, there's going to be somebody on the periphery that you can talk to first. There's not your magic circle like some of the Wiccans would say that they have necessarily. It's still a sacred space.
Sure.
The space is hallowed beforehand. But to a public service professional, whether it's law enforcement, probation officer, parole officer, any of that, if you're going into somebody's home and you find a number of items laid out, there was an incident, if there is somebody there to ask about it, Definitely do that. Hey, what are these things? Okay. If it's obvious that there's nothing harmful there, I would simply say just be respectful with them and say, okay, we need to investigate this area. You understand that? Can you put your stuff away somewhere? Maintain your officer safety while you do that, of course. But at the same time, just don't start grabbing things and, dumping them on the floor or anything like that either.
It brings to mind some of the knee jerk reactions that we saw back in the 1980s with
Oh,
when the big panic was that Satanism was everywhere, and anyone that practiced any sort of magical or esoteric tradition, was probably doing heinous, violent things, behind closed doors. And there were incidents in which officers would walk in and, they may see a crystal, they may see candles burning.
mm-hmm.
And there was this knee jerk reaction to, oh, we need to collect this. This is paraphernalia being used in some sort of, clandestine ceremony. Um, Again, taking it back to showing that sensitivity, showing that understanding that this is someone's sacred space. And
Mm-hmm.
these tools, while they may look very mundane to an outsider, are of great importance to the person that uses them to interact with with deity. And so,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, I think it's important, as you said, just understand that, hey, if you have to ask someone to move something, if you have to move something working at a scene, work with that person on what would be the most culturally sensitive way to have that object or that location placed in a way where everyone feels safe, and where if certain procedures need to be followed to work a scene, that they're able to be worked around those specific items and spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's vitally important, I think. And just showing that initial respect could be the big difference between somebody cooperating with the investigation or completely shutting down.
Great point. That's You can burn cultural bridges of communication real easy, and we have to keep in mind that this is as if someone walked into your church, your mosque, your tabernacle, your place of worship, and how would you want them to interact with the tools in your space, sacred space?
Mm-hmm.
And how would you want them to interact in a manner that shows respect to your sacred space? So I think that's an excellent point. DJ, is there anything you would like to add into what we've touched on?
I suppose the biggest thing, going back to going into the crime scenes, when I train people with this type of thing as well, it's okay to not know everything, and really you don't have to. The big thing is go in there, be respectful, and if you don't know, just ask the people. 9 times out of 10, they'll be very appreciative that you took the time to bother with that.
Absolutely. Respect goes a long way. I'm going to share a quick story with our listeners. And DJ, I shared this with you earlier.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of weeks ago, I was taken by to meet a traditional practitioner of the Dominican spiritual tradition of 21 divisions. And this priest, who one of the officers was very familiar with, was very kind and inviting and hospitable, and brought us into his home and showed us his home, and even took us down to his sacred space and showed us some of his shrines and areas that he did work with. And as we were leaving this site where all of these sacred spaces were, one of the officers accidentally stepped on a plate that contained offerings
Mm.
for a particular deity. Now, the officer looked like he just really stepped on a snake. He obviously had no idea what it was and what was going to happen. And we go to walk out the door, and the officer stops the priest and says, "Sir, I'm sorry, but I stepped on this plate." And The priest said, "Which plate are you talking about?" And he takes him and he points and shows him. And the priest and says, "No, it's okay. It's all right. No worries. It was a mistake. It's okay." But what a great example of how we have to be mindful when we are in someone's home and when we are in these sacred spaces. Obviously that was a mistake,
Hmm.
and there was no harm, no foul, but that could have been a bad situation depending on how that was handled. And everything worked out, but it all came down to respect. And that respect that you're talking about, DJ, is the primary focus we want to promote with this show. Is you don't have to be a religious expert, you don't have to understand every sacred tradition you encounter in the field, but just having that fundamental practice of showing respect toward that thing that is valuable, that is sacred to the individuals that you may be dealing with, will definitely go a long way, and is definitely a way for us to all rebuild, I think, some areas of trust and respect that may have chipped away in some scenarios.
Yep, I agree. Definitely. And one other way to look at it too is if you form a good relationship with that person and you need some help in the future on something, you might actually have a knowledgeable source that you can tap at that point too. It always pays to build a good relationship with somebody. I mean, it's free. It's easy to do.
And DJ, this has been a fascinating time with you, and I appreciate your message of being discerning as you look at different scenarios where we may see evidence of this particular spirit set of spiritual traditions, and understanding that, hey, the majority of the world that are embracing these traditions are not part of these groups that are building hate in our communities.
Hmm.
And it's been a fascinating time, Stephen. Do you have anything else you want to share with us?
Well, I just would like to, encourage all of our listeners to approach these types of scenes with an open mind and, like what was mentioned earlier, respect, and suggest that, they further research a topic because it's kind of interesting cross culturally, and I'm sure they're going to get a lot out of it.
Absolutely. So, DJ, how can people contact you?
One of the probably the best way is to go through my website. It's runeresearch.com. Rune research being all one word, and there's a contact form on there. Otherwise, people can email me directly. The email address is david@runeresearch.com.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much, DJ. Stephen, also, thank you so much for coming along.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you too.
I want to thank you both, and we thank you for sharing your time and of your experiences. Stephen, great to have you, and I look forward to many more episodes with you in the future. Remember, folks, when we look at the mysterious, let us look at demystifying the mysterious. And when the secular meets the sacred, we will share about it in future episodes. So thank you, listeners, for listening to this episode of Crime Scenes and Cultures.